Every chapter of the past is like a candle in the dark, casting shadows, warmth, and the memory of countless lives lived long before us. If you listen closely, you might almost hear the chanting of monks, the ringing of church bells, and the quiet footsteps of pilgrims walking dusty roads toward holy shrines. Tonight, we turn to the world of medieval religion history, a time when faith guided kings and peasants alike, when towering cathedrals rose toward the heavens, and when prayers, rituals, and sacred traditions shaped every moment of daily life. It was a world filled with devotion, mystery, and questions about the divine that still echo in our own time. Before we begin, let yourself grow still. Find a place of rest, breathe deeply, and let the noise of the present gently fade into silence. I invite you to subscribe to the channel, because your support is the little spark that keeps these stories alive. And in the comments, share where in the world you are listening from. It always amazes me how far history can travel. Now, close your eyes and join me on this quiet journey through the sacred halls and silent cloisters of the Middle Ages, where history is more than facts. It is a prayer, a whisper, and a soft reminder of the human search for meaning. The medieval period, spanning roughly from 500 to 1500 CE, represents one of the most religiously dynamic and transformative epochs in human history. This era witnessed the consolidation of Christianity as the dominant force in Western Europe, the rise and expansion of Islam across vast territories, the persistence and evolution of Judaism despite persecution, and the continuation of various folk religions and pagan traditions that gradually syncretized with or were suppressed by the major monotheistic faiths. The medieval religious landscape was characterized by several defining features: the institutionalization of religious authority, the development of sophisticated theological systems, the emergence of new forms of spiritual practice, and the complex interplay between religious and secular power. This thousand-year period saw the establishment of the papal monarchy, the rise of monastic orders, the flowering of scholastic theology, the trauma of religious warfare, and ultimately the seeds of religious reform that would transform the Christian world. Understanding medieval religion requires recognizing that the modern concept of separation between church and state was largely foreign to medieval minds. Religion permeated every aspect of life, from politics and law to art and agriculture. The sacred and secular were not distinct realms but rather different manifestations of a unified cosmic order in which God's will was understood to govern all human affairs. This comprehensive examination will explore the evolution of medieval Christianity from its post-Roman foundations through the great reforms and crises of the later Middle Ages, while also addressing the parallel developments in Islam, Judaism, and other religious traditions that shaped the medieval world. We will trace the institutional, intellectual, and spiritual developments that defined this crucial period in religious history. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century created a religious and political vacuum that Christianity gradually filled. The Church had already achieved official recognition under Constantine in the early 4th century, but the fall of centralized imperial authority forced Christian leaders to assume new roles as political and cultural leaders. This transition was neither smooth nor uniform across the former Roman territories. In the immediate aftermath of Rome's decline, the Bishop of Rome emerged as the most significant religious figure in Western Christianity. Pope Leo I, 440 to 461, articulated the doctrine of papal primacy, claiming that the Bishop of Rome inherited the authority of St. Peter as the foundation of the universal Church. This assertion would become central to medieval Christianity, though it faced consistent challenges from both Eastern Christianity and secular rulers. The conversion of the Germanic tribes represented one of the most significant religious developments of the early medieval period. Unlike the gradual Christianization of the Roman Empire, the the conversion of barbarian peoples often occurred through the conversion of their kings, followed by mass baptisms of entire tribes. The Frankish king Clovis's conversion around 496 CE exemplified this pattern and had profound consequences for the development of medieval European Christianity. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain, the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, and various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Britain each developed distinctive forms of Christianity that blended Germanic traditions with Roman Christian practices. This synthesis created regional variations in Christian practice that would persist throughout the medieval period. The rise of monasticism. Monasticism emerged as one of the most influential religious movements of the early medieval period. Building on the earlier ascetic traditions of the Desert Fathers in Egypt and Syria, Western monasticism took distinctive forms that would shape medieval spirituality for centuries. Saint Benedict of Nursia, c. 480 to 547, created the most influential monastic rule in Western Christianity. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized moderation, community life, and the balance of prayer, work, and study. Benedictine monasteries became centers of learning, agricultural innovation, and spiritual authority that served as the backbone of medieval European civilization. Monasteries served multiple functions in early medieval society. They preserved classical learning through their libraries and scriptoriums, provided social services to local communities, served as centers of agricultural innovation, and offered a spiritual alternative to the increasingly worldly concerns of secular clergy. The monastic ideal of withdrawal from the world paradoxically made monks influential participants in worldly affairs. The spread of monasticism was facilitated by the support of secular rulers who saw monasteries as sources of spiritual legitimacy and practical administration. Charlemagne's support for monastic reform in the late 8th and early 9th centuries exemplified the symbiotic relationship between monastic communities and political authority. Irish monasticism developed along somewhat different lines, emphasizing scholarship, missionary activity, and a more ascetic lifestyle. Irish monks played crucial roles in the Christianization of Scotland, northern England, and parts of continental Europe. The distinctive Celtic Christian traditions that emerged in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales maintained certain practices that differed from Roman Christianity, leading to tensions that were resolved at the Synod of Whitby in 664. The missionary expansion. The Christianization of Europe required extensive missionary activity that transformed both the religion itself and the societies it encountered. The most successful missionaries understood that conversion required not just the adoption of Christian beliefs but the transformation of entire cultural systems. St. Patrick's mission to Ireland in the 5th century established Christianity in a society that had never been part of the Roman Empire. Patrick's approach of working with existing clan structures while gradually introducing Christian concepts became a model for missionary activity in other non-Roman territories. The Anglo-Saxon conversions of the 6th and 7th centuries demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of royal conversion. Kings like Ethelbert of Kent accepted Christianity partly for political reasons, seeking closer ties with the Frankish kingdom and Roman prestige. However, the conversion of the nobility did not automatically guarantee the conversion of common people, who often maintained older religious practices alongside Christian observances. St. Columba's mission to Scotland and St. Augustine's mission to England represented different approaches to Christianization. Columba worked within existing Celtic traditions, while Augustine sought to impose Roman practices more directly. These different approaches created tensions between Celtic and Roman Christianity that required ongoing resolution. The missionary expansion also involved the development of new theological approaches to non-Christian religions. Early medieval missionaries grappled with questions about the relationship between Christian truth and pagan wisdom, the fate of unbaptized ancestors, and the proper response to non-Christian religious practices. The iconoclastic controversies. The relationship between Eastern and Western Christianity became increasingly strained during the early medieval period, particularly over the question of religious images. The iconoclastic controversy, which raged in the Byzantine Empire from 726 to 843, had significant implications for Western Christianity as well. The Byzantine Emperor Leo III's edict against religious images in 726 was based on theological concerns about idolatry, but it also reflected political tensions with the growing power of monasteries, which were major producers and promoters of religious art. The controversy revealed fundamental differences in how Eastern and Western Christians understood the relationship between the material and spiritual worlds. Pope Gregory II's opposition to iconoclasm marked an important assertion of papal independence from Byzantine authority. Western Christianity generally supported the use of religious images, viewing them as aids to devotion rather than objects of worship. This position was formally articulated at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, though iconoclastic policies were revived in the Byzantine Empire from 815 to 843. The iconoclastic controversies contributed to the growing separation between Eastern and Western Christianity. They also stimulated theological reflection on the nature of religious art, the role of tradition in Christian practice, and the relationship between imperial and ecclesiastical authority. The coronation of Charlemagne as emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day 800 CE marked a pivotal moment in medieval religious and political history. This event represented the fusion of Germanic kingship, Roman imperial tradition, and Christian authority that would define much of medieval European civilization. Charlemagne's relationship with the Church was complex and sometimes contradictory. While he accepted papal coronation and promoted Christian missionary activity, he also insisted on his right to intervene in ecclesiastical affairs. His capitularies regulated clerical behavior, monastic practices, and theological education, establishing precedents for imperial involvement in religious matters that would persist throughout the medieval period. The Carolingian court became a center of religious and intellectual renewal. Alcuin of York, Charlemagne's chief educational advisor, developed educational reforms that standardized Latin literacy, promoted theological study, and established cathedral and monastic schools throughout the empire. These educational initiatives had profound long-term effects on the development of medieval intellectual culture. Charlemagne's support for missionary activity among the Saxons, Avars, and Slavs extended Christian influence into new territories, though often through methods that combined evangelization with military conquest. The forced conversions and destruction of pagan shrines that characterized some of these missions reflected the increasingly militant character of medieval Christianity. The Carolingian theological renaissance. The intellectual revival associated with Charlemagne's reign stimulated new forms of theological inquiry and religious practice. The standardization of liturgical texts, the production of illuminated manuscripts, and the establishment of scriptoriums in monasteries and cathedrals created new opportunities for religious expression and theological development. The Libri Carolini, produced at Charlemagne's court in response to the Second Council of Nicaea, articulated a distinctive Western position on religious images that differed from both Byzantine iconoclasm and Byzantine iconophilia. This work demonstrated the growing theological sophistication of Carolingian scholars and their willingness to challenge both Eastern and papal authority on theological matters. Theodulf of Orleans, Alcuin of York, and other scholars associated with the Carolingian court produced theological works that synthesized patristic learning with contemporary concerns. Their writings on predestination, the Eucharist, and ecclesiastical authority influenced theological development for centuries. The standardization of the Roman liturgy throughout the Carolingian Empire had profound effects on the development of medieval Christianity. The imposition of Roman practices displaced local liturgical traditions but also created a sense of Christian unity that transcended political boundaries. Monastic reform movements. The 9th and 10th centuries witnessed several important monastic reform movements that sought to restore the spiritual fervor and discipline that many believed had declined since the early days of monasticism. These reforms had significant effects on both religious practice and secular society. The reforms initiated at the monastery of Cluny, founded in 910, represented the most influential monastic reform movement of the period. Cluny's emphasis on liturgical elaboration, strict adherence to the Benedictine rule, and independence from secular control influenced hundreds of monasteries throughout Europe. The Cluniac reforms also promoted the idea that monks should focus primarily on prayer and worship rather than manual labor or secular administration. The Cluniac emphasis on elaborate liturgy reflected broader changes in medieval religious sensibility. The multiplication of daily prayers, the extension of the liturgical calendar, and the development of complex musical settings for religious services all reflected a growing emphasis on the beauty and majesty of divine worship. Cluniac monasteries also played important roles in promoting pilgrimages, particularly to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. The development of pilgrimage routes and the construction of churches and hostels to serve pilgrims represented new forms of religious expression that connected local communities to broader Christian networks. The raids on Lindisfarne in 793, Iona in 795, and other major religious centers shocked the Christian world and seemed to many to herald apocalyptic times. The Alcuin's letter responding to the Lindisfarne raid expressed the theological difficulties that Christians faced in understanding why God would permit such attacks on his holy places. The Viking challenges also stimulated new forms of Christian resistance and adaptation. The development of fortified monasteries, the creation of mobile religious communities, and the adaptation of Christian practices to meet the needs of communities under threat all reflected the resilience of medieval Christianity. The eventual conversion of Viking societies to Christianity represented one of the most significant religious developments of the late medieval period. The conversions of Denmark, Norway, and Iceland between the 10th and 12th centuries extended Christian influence throughout Northern Europe and created new opportunities for cultural synthesis. The Gregorian Reform. The 11th century marked a period of unprecedented reform and renewal in the Catholic Church, culminating in the pontificate of Pope Gregory VII, 1073 to 1085. The Gregorian Reform, as this movement came to be known, represented a fundamental transformation in the Church's understanding of its role in medieval society. The Reformers identified several key problems that they believed were corrupting the Church: simony, the buying and selling of church offices, Nicolaitism, clerical marriage and concubinage, and lay investiture, the appointment of bishops and abbots by secular rulers. These practices, they argued, compromised the spiritual independence of the Church and reduced clergy to mere functionaries of secular power. Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida articulated the theological foundations of reform in his works against simony and lay investiture. He argued that the Church possessed a divinely ordained hierarchy that secular powers could not legitimately control. This position implied a fundamental reordering of the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. Pope Gregory VII Dictatus Papae, 1075, made unprecedented claims for papal authority, asserting that the Pope could depose emperors, that papal legates took precedence over all bishops, and that the Roman Church had never erred and would never err. These claims sparked the investiture controversy with Emperor Henry IV that dominated European politics for decades. The confrontation between Gregory VII and Henry IV at Canossa in 1077 became one of the most famous episodes in medieval history. Henry's penance in the snow demonstrated the potential power of papal authority, though his subsequent deposition of Gregory showed the continuing strength of imperial resistance to papal claims. The rise of scholasticism. The 12th and 13th centuries witnessed the emergence of scholasticism, a new approach to theology and philosophy that sought to reconcile Christian faith with classical learning, particularly the newly recovered works of Aristotle. This intellectual movement transformed medieval Christianity and laid the foundations for later theological development. The establishment of cathedral schools and the emergence of universities created new institutional contexts for theological education. The University of Paris became the preeminent center of theological study, while the University of Bologna specialized in canon law. These institutions attracted students from throughout Europe and created networks of learned clergy who shared common intellectual traditions. Peter Abelard, 1079–1142, exemplified both the possibilities and dangers of the new scholastic approach. His Sic et non demonstrated how dialectical methods could be applied to theological questions by juxtaposing apparently contradictory statements from Scripture and the Church Fathers. However, his theological positions on the Trinity and other matters led to condemnation by ecclesiastical authorities. The recovery of Aristotelian philosophy through Arabic translations posed particular challenges for Christian theologians. Aristotle's works on physics, metaphysics, and ethics offered sophisticated philosophical tools, but they also contained positions that seemed incompatible with Christian teaching, such as the eternity of the world and the denial of individual immortality. Saint Thomas Aquinas, 1225–1274, achieved the most successful synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. His Summa Theologica provided a comprehensive theological system that incorporated Aristotelian insights while maintaining orthodox Christian positions. Thomas's work demonstrated that reason and faith were compatible and mutually reinforcing rather than contradictory. The Franciscan theological tradition, represented by figures like Saint Bonaventure and later John Duns Scotus, offered alternative approaches to scholastic theology that emphasized the primacy of will over intellect and maintained greater suspicion of philosophical speculation. These differences created ongoing theological debates that enriched medieval intellectual life. The Mendicant Orders. The early 13th century saw the emergence of new religious orders that revolutionized medieval spirituality. The Franciscans and Dominicans, known as mendicant, begging, orders, rejected the traditional monastic emphasis on stability and instead embraced mobility, poverty, and active engagement with the world. Saint Francis of Assisi, 1181–1226, founded the Franciscan order based on a radical commitment to evangelical poverty and service to the poor. Francis's conversion experience and his embrace of lady poverty represented a new form of Christian discipleship that challenged both the wealth of the established church and the values of emerging commercial society. The Franciscan emphasis on preaching, care for lepers, and identification with the poor attracted thousands of followers and forced the church hierarchy to grapple with new forms of religious life. Francis's testament revealed tensions between his original vision and the institutional needs of a growing religious order. Saint Dominic, 1170–1221, founded the Dominican order with a more specific focus on preaching and combating heresy through education and theological sophistication. The Dominicans became the Church's primary intellectual order, producing many of the most important theologians and philosophers of the High Middle Ages. The mendicant order's involvement in university teaching transformed medieval theological education. Dominican and Franciscan masters at the University of Paris and other institutions developed distinctive theological traditions that competed with each other and with the secular clergy for intellectual leadership. The success of the mendicant orders also created new problems for the Church. Their popularity sometimes undermined the authority of local bishops and parish priests, while their claims to evangelical perfection implicitly criticized the worldliness of other clergy. These tensions led to ongoing conflicts throughout the later medieval period. The Crusading movement. The First Crusade, launched by Pope Urban II in 1095, initiated a series of military expeditions that profoundly shaped medieval Christianity's understanding of holy war, pilgrimage, and relations with non-Christian peoples. The crusading movement represented both the height of medieval Christian confidence and a source of ongoing moral complexity. Urban II's call for the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont combined several motivations: responding to Byzantine requests for assistance against Muslim advances, channeling the violence of feudal warfare toward religious purposes, and asserting papal leadership over Christendom. The enthusiastic response to Urban's call demonstrated the appeal of combining military adventure with spiritual reward. The success of the First Crusade in capturing Jerusalem in 1099 seemed to many Christians to vindicate the crusading ideal. The establishment of Crusader states in the Holy Land created new opportunities for cultural contact between Christians and Muslims, though these interactions were often characterized by suspicion and violence. The development of the military orders, the Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and Teutonic Knights, represented new forms of religious life that combined monastic vows with military service. These orders played crucial roles in defending Crusader territories and became wealthy and powerful institutions that influenced European politics for centuries. The Second and Third Crusades' limited success, and the eventual loss of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187, forced Christians to reconsider the relationship between military success and divine favor. The Fourth Crusade's diversion to Constantinople in 1204 further complicated the crusading ideal and damaged relations between Eastern and Western Christianity. The extension of crusading ideology to campaigns against heretics, pagans, and political enemies of the papacy transformed the original concept beyond recognition. The Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars in southern France and the Baltic Crusades against pagan peoples demonstrated both the flexibility and the dangers of holy war ideology. Gothic architecture and religious expression. The development of Gothic architecture in the 12th century created new possibilities for religious expression that reflected changing theological emphases and devotional practices. The soaring spaces, elaborate decoration, and technical innovations of Gothic cathedrals embodied medieval Christianity's aspirations toward transcendence and divine beauty. The Abbey of St. Denis, rebuilt under Abbot Suger in the 1140s, pioneered many features that would define Gothic architecture: pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and large windows filled with stained glass. Suger's writings on the reconstruction revealed a theology of light that understood material beauty as a pathway to spiritual truth. The great cathedral-building campaigns of the 12th and 13th centuries represented massive communal efforts that involved entire urban communities. The construction of Notre Dame de Paris, Chartres Cathedral, and Reims Cathedral required decades of work and enormous financial resources that testify to the central importance of religious architecture in medieval society. Gothic cathedrals served multiple functions beyond religious worship. They were centers of education, social gathering, and economic activity. The development of cathedral schools, the performance of religious dramas, and the holding of markets in cathedral precincts all demonstrated the integration of sacred and secular life. The iconographic programs of Gothic cathedrals provided comprehensive visual education for largely illiterate populations. The sculpted portals, stained glass windows, and painted interior decorations told biblical stories, illustrated theological concepts, and provided moral instruction in accessible visual form. The Avignon Papacy and the Great Western Schism. The transfer of the papal court from Rome to Avignon in 1309 initiated a period of crisis that fundamentally challenged medieval assumptions about papal authority and church unity. The Avignon Papacy, lasting until 1377, created new tensions between the papacy and European rulers while raising questions about the relationship between the spiritual and temporal roles of the Pope. Pope Clement V's move to Avignon was initially presented as temporary, but the establishment of an elaborate papal court in France suggested more permanent arrangements. The Avignon Pope's dependence on French political support compromised their claims to universal spiritual authority and created suspicions about their independence among other European rulers. The Avignon Papacy was characterized by increasing financial sophistication and administrative centralization. The development of new forms of papal taxation, the expansion of papal provisions to benefices, and the growth of the papal bureaucracy all reflected attempts to create more effective church government, but they also generated criticism from those who saw such developments as evidence of papal worldliness. The return of the papal court to Rome under Gregory XI in 1377 was intended to restore papal prestige, but Gregory's death shortly after the return led to the election of Urban VI, whose harsh treatment of the cardinals prompted them to elect a rival pope, Clement VII, who returned to Avignon. This Great Western Schism, 1378 to 1417, divided European Christianity into competing obediences. The existence of two and later three competing papal claimants created unprecedented challenges for medieval Christianity. Questions arose about which pope was legitimate, whether church councils could resolve the crisis, and what authority remained valid during the schism. These challenges stimulated new theories about church government and papal authority. The Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, finally resolved the Great Western Schism through the deposition of all competing papal claimants and the election of Martin V as the sole pope. However, the council's assertion of conciliar authority over papal power created ongoing tensions about the ultimate source of authority within the Church. Conciliarism and church reform. The conciliar movement that emerged during the Great Western Schism represented a fundamental challenge to papal monarchy and proposed alternative models of church government based on representative assemblies of clergy and learned lay people. This movement had profound implications for both ecclesiology and political theory. The theory of conciliarism was developed by theologians like Jean Gerson and Pierre Dully, who argued that general councils of the Church possessed authority superior to that of individual popes. They based their arguments on canon law precedents, patristic texts, and philosophical arguments about the nature of corporate authority. The Council of Constance not only resolved the papal schism but also condemned the teachings of John Wycliffe and Jan Hus, demonstrating the council's claim to doctrinal authority. The execution of Hus despite his safe conduct guarantee created outrage in Bohemia and contributed to the Hussite wars that devastated Central Europe for decades. The Council of Basel, 1431 to 1449, pushed conciliar claims to their logical extreme by attempting to subordinate papal authority entirely to conciliar control. The conflict between the council and Pope Eugene IV eventually led to a division within the conciliar movement itself and the gradual restoration of papal authority. The failure of radical conciliarism did not end demands for church reform. Throughout the 15th century, reform councils, individual reformers, and secular rulers continued to press for changes in church practices, clerical behavior, and institutional structures. The conciliar crisis stimulated new thinking about authority, representation, and consent that influenced not only ecclesiastical institutions but also secular political theory. The arguments developed by conciliar theorists about the limits of monarchical authority and the rights of representative assemblies contributed to broader discussions about political legitimacy. Mysticism and popular religion. The 14th and 15th centuries witnessed a remarkable flowering of mystical spirituality that offered alternatives to the increasingly complex theological and institutional developments of the later medieval church. This mystical renaissance reflected both dissatisfaction with external religious forms and a desire for more immediate religious experience. The Rhineland mystics, including Meister Eckhart, Johannes Thaler, and Heinrich Suso, developed sophisticated theological accounts of the soul's union with God that drew on both scholastic learning and personal spiritual experience. Eckhart's teachings about the ground of the soul and the birth of God in the soul pushed mystical theology to its limits and resulted in ecclesiastical condemnation of some of his positions. The Devotio Moderna movement, originating in the Netherlands, promoted practical spirituality focused on the imitation of Christ's life rather than speculative theology. The Brethren of the Common Life established schools and communities that emphasized personal devotion, moral reform, and practical Christian living. Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ, produced within the Devotio Moderna tradition, became one of the most widely read religious books of the later medieval period. Its emphasis on interior spirituality, suspicion of learning for its own sake, and focus on personal relationship with Christ reflected broader trends in late medieval piety. Female mystics like Julian of Norwich, Marguerite Porete, and Catherine of Siena developed distinctive forms of mystical theology that often emphasized divine love, spiritual marriage, and prophetic authority. These women's writings challenged conventional assumptions about religious authority while contributing significantly to theological development. The growth of lay religious movements reflected both the increasing literacy of urban populations and dissatisfaction with clerical mediation of religious experience. Lay confraternities, third orders affiliated with mendicant communities, and independent religious groups all sought to create more active roles for non-clerical Christians. Heresy and reform movements. The later medieval period witnessed the emergence of several significant heretical movements that challenged orthodox Christian teaching and authority. These movements often combined theological dissent with social and political criticism, making them particularly threatening to established authorities. The Waldensian movement, originating in the 12th century but persisting throughout the later medieval period, emphasized apostolic poverty, vernacular Bible reading, and lay preaching. Despite repeated persecution, Waldensian communities survived in Alpine regions and would eventually align with Protestant reformers in the 16th century. The Cathar movement in southern France represented a more radical challenge to Orthodox Christianity through its dualistic theology that viewed the material world as fundamentally evil. The Albigensian Crusade and subsequent Inquisition largely eliminated Catharism, but its influence on medieval spirituality and the development of inquisitorial procedures was significant. John Wycliffe's teachings at Oxford University challenged papal authority, clerical privilege, and transubstantiation while promoting vernacular Bible translation and lay religious authority. Although condemned by the Church, Wycliffe's ideas influenced reform movements throughout Europe and contributed to the development of English Protestant thought. The Hussite movement in Bohemia combined Wycliffe's theological ideas with Czech nationalism and social reform. Jan Hus's preaching at Prague and his execution at the Council of Constance sparked decades of religious warfare that devastated Central Europe and demonstrated the political implications of religious reform. The Lollard movement in England promoted Wycliffe's ideas among craftsmen, merchants, and lower clergy while advocating for religious and social reforms. Despite persecution, Lalit communities persisted into the 16th century and influenced the development of English Protestantism. The Renaissance papacy. The restoration of papal authority after the conciliar crisis led to the emergence of the Renaissance papacy, characterized by the adoption of humanist culture, involvement in Italian politics, and ambitious artistic patronage. This development created new tensions between spiritual and temporal concerns that contributed to demands for reform. Pope Nicholas V, 1447 to 1455, initiated the transformation of Rome into a Renaissance city through ambitious building projects and the patronage of humanist scholars. The Vatican Library, founded during Nicholas's pontificate, became one of Europe's most important repositories of classical and Christian learning. The Borgia Pope Alexander VI, 1492 to 1503, exemplified both the possibilities and problems of Renaissance papal culture. His patronage of artists like Pinturicchio created magnificent works of art, but his involvement in Italian politics and his scandalous personal life generated widespread criticism of papal worldliness. Pope Julius II, 1503 to 1513, continued the Renaissance transformation of Rome through his patronage of Michelangelo, Raphael, and Bramante. The reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica, begun during Julius's pontificate, represented the height of Renaissance papal ambition but also required new forms of fundraising that would contribute to Protestant criticism. The Renaissance Pope's adoption of humanist culture created new opportunities for intellectual exchange but also raised questions about the compatibility of classical learning with Christian values. The revival of interest in pagan philosophy, literature, and art challenged traditional assumptions about the relationship between Christian and classical culture. The financial demands of Renaissance papal projects, particularly the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica, led to controversial fundraising methods including the sale of indulgences. These practices would become major sources of criticism from reform movements and would contribute directly to the Protestant Reformation. The rise and expansion of Islam. The emergence of Islam in the 7th century created a new religious and political force that profoundly affected the development of medieval Christianity. The rapid expansion of Islamic power from Spain to Central Asia challenged Christian assumptions about religious truth and political authority while creating new contexts for interfaith encounter. The Prophet Muhammad's revelations and the subsequent compilation of the Quran presented a religious message that acknowledged Christianity and Judaism as earlier revelations while claiming to provide God's final and complete guidance. This position created complex relationships with Christian communities that combined respect for Christian religious figures with criticism of Christian theological developments. The Islamic conquest of former Christian territories in Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa resulted in the incorporation of large Christian populations within Islamic states. The development of dhimmi status provided legal protection for Christians while establishing their subordinate position within Islamic society. The Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates created sophisticated administrative systems that often employed Christian officials and scholars. The translation movement that brought Greek philosophical and scientific works into Arabic involved extensive collaboration between Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars and contributed to the preservation and development of classical learning. The Islamic conquest of Spain in 711 brought Muslims into direct contact with Western European Christianity and created a complex multicultural society in Al-Andalus. Christian communities under Islamic rule, Mozarabs, developed distinctive forms of religious practice while maintaining connections to broader Christian networks. Christian-Muslim intellectual exchange. Despite political and military conflicts, medieval Christians and Muslims engaged in extensive intellectual exchange that influenced theological, philosophical, and scientific development in both traditions. This exchange was particularly important for the development of scholastic theology and the recovery of Aristotelian philosophy in Western Europe. The translation of Arabic works into Latin in centers like Toledo and Palermo made available to Christian scholars not only Greek classics but also original Islamic contributions to philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and other fields. Scholars like Gerard of Cremona and Michael Scott played crucial roles in this translation movement. Christian scholars encountered sophisticated Islamic theological and philosophical systems through the works of Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Averroes, and Al-Ghazali. These works presented alternative approaches to questions about the relationship between reason and revelation, the nature of God, and the possibility of philosophical knowledge of religious truths. The influence of Islamic philosophy on Christian thought was particularly evident in the work of Thomas Aquinas, who engaged extensively with Averroes's commentaries on Aristotle while developing his own synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. The Thomistic synthesis would not have been possible without this Islamic philosophical foundation. Christian missionary activity among Muslims was limited but persistent throughout the medieval period. Figures like Ramon Llull developed new apologetic methods that sought to demonstrate the truth of Christianity through rational argument rather than coercion. These efforts had limited success but contributed to the development of comparative theology. The experience of Christians living under Islamic rule generated new forms of apologetic literature that sought to defend Christian beliefs against Islamic criticisms. Works like the Apology of Al-Kindi and the writings of Theodore Abu Qurra demonstrated sophisticated engagement with Islamic theological arguments. The Crusades and Christian-Muslim relations. The crusading movement fundamentally altered Christian-Muslim relations and created lasting legacies of mistrust and misunderstanding. While the military aspects of the Crusades were relatively limited in scope, their ideological and cultural effects were profound and enduring. The development of crusading ideology represented a significant departure from earlier Christian attitudes toward warfare and non-Christians. The promise of indulgences for crusaders, the characterization of warfare against Muslims as pilgrimage, and the rhetoric of holy war created new forms of religious violence that would influence Christian attitudes for centuries. The establishment of crusader states in the Holy Land created unique contexts for Christian-Muslim interaction. Despite ongoing warfare, practical necessities led to diplomatic relations, commercial cooperation, and cultural exchange between Christian and Muslim rulers and populations. The military orders that emerged during the crusading period developed sophisticated understandings of Islamic society and military tactics. The Templars, Hospitallers, and other orders maintained networks of contacts throughout the Middle East and served as intermediaries between Christian and Muslim authorities. The failure of the later Crusades and the eventual loss of all Crusader territories forced Christians to reconsider the relationship between military success and divine favor. The development of alternative approaches to Muslim-Christian relations, including missionary activity and theological dialogue, reflected this changing understanding. The Muslim response to the Crusades, particularly under leaders like Saladin and Baibars, demonstrated the possibility of effective resistance to Christian expansion while maintaining relatively tolerant policies toward Christian populations. These examples provided alternative models for interfaith relations. Islamic influence on Christian practice. Beyond intellectual exchange, Islamic practices and institutions influenced Christian development in numerous ways, particularly in regions where Christians and Muslims lived in close proximity. These influences were often subtle and indirect but nonetheless significant. The Islamic emphasis on regular prayer, pilgrimage, and charitable giving resonated with Christian practices and may have influenced the development of similar Christian institutions. The sophistication of Islamic legal systems also provided models for Christian canon law development. Islamic architectural styles influenced Christian church construction, particularly in Spain, Sicily, and other regions with significant Muslim populations. The use of geometric decoration, horseshoe arches, and other Islamic features in Christian buildings demonstrated the permeability of cultural boundaries. The Islamic tradition of theological education through madrasas may have influenced the development of Christian cathedral schools and universities. The emphasis on systematic theological study and the integration of philosophy with religious learning were common features of both Islamic and Christian educational institutions. Sufi mystical traditions showed remarkable parallels with Christian mysticism, and direct influence may have occurred through personal contacts between Christian and Muslim mystics. The emphasis on divine love, spiritual marriage, and contemplative practices appeared in both traditions during the medieval period. Jewish communities in medieval Europe. Jewish communities played significant roles in medieval European society despite facing persistent discrimination and periodic persecution. The complex relationship between Christian and Jewish communities reflected both theological tensions and practical necessities that shaped the development of both traditions. The legal status of Jews in medieval Europe was generally defined by Christian theology, which viewed Judaism as a superseded religion whose adherents nonetheless served important functions in God's plan. The Augustinian doctrine of Jewish witness held that Jews should be preserved but subordinated as testimony to Christian truth. Papal bulls like Sicut Judaize, first issued by Calixtus II around 1120, provided theoretical protection for Jewish communities while affirming their inferior status. These documents prohibited forced conversion, the destruction of synagogues, and violence against Jews, but they also restricted Jewish activities and confirmed Christian supremacy. Jewish communities developed sophisticated forms of self-government that allowed them to maintain religious and cultural autonomy while fulfilling their obligations to Christian rulers. Rabbinical courts, communal councils, and educational institutions created parallel structures that preserved Jewish law and tradition. The economic roles of Jewish communities in medieval Europe were often shaped by Christian restrictions on Jewish participation in certain occupations and guild membership. Many Jews became involved in commerce, money lending, and other activities that Christians were forbidden or reluctant to pursue, creating both opportunities and vulnerabilities. Jewish intellectual life and Christian scholarship. Medieval Jewish scholars made significant contributions to philosophy, biblical exegesis, and theological development that influenced Christian thought in complex ways. The encounter between Jewish and Christian learning occurred through multiple channels despite official restrictions on interfaith dialogue. Moses Maimonides, 1135 to 1204, created the most influential synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Jewish theology in his Guide for the Perplexed. This work influenced Christian scholastics like Thomas Aquinas, who engaged seriously with Maimonidean arguments while developing his own theological system. Rashi, 1040 to 1105, produced biblical and Talmudic commentaries that became standard reference works for Jewish scholarship. Christian scholars, particularly those involved in biblical translation and exegesis, consulted Jewish commentators and sometimes incorporated their insights into Christian works. The development of Kabbalah, Jewish mystical tradition, paralleled Christian mystical developments and may have involved some cross-fertilization of ideas. Both traditions emphasized the possibility of direct spiritual experience and developed sophisticated theories about the relationship between the divine and material worlds. Jewish communities in Spain, particularly during the period of relative tolerance under Islamic rule, produced scholars who contributed to philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and other fields. The translation of Jewish works into Latin made these contributions available to Christian scholars throughout Europe. The forced public disputations that Christian authorities sometimes organized between Jewish and Christian scholars revealed both the sophistication of Jewish learning and the persistence of theological disagreements. Famous debates like the Disputation of Barcelona, 1263, demonstrated the intellectual vitality of both traditions while highlighting irreconcilable differences. Anti-Jewish violence and persecution. The later medieval period witnessed increasing persecution of Jewish communities that culminated in expulsions, massacres, and forced conversions. These developments reflected changing Christian attitudes toward religious diversity and the increasing power of Christian institutions. The First Crusade marked a turning point in Christian-Jewish relations through the massacres of Jewish communities in the Rhineland and other regions. The connection between crusading ideology and anti-Jewish violence established patterns that would recur throughout the medieval period. Blood libel accusations, which claimed that Jews murdered Christian children for ritual purposes, began appearing in the 12th century and became recurring sources of anti-Jewish violence. These accusations, though consistently rejected by informed Christian authorities, gained popular credence and led to numerous attacks on Jewish communities. The Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, mandated distinctive clothing for Jews and prohibited them from holding public office, reflecting the increasing institutionalization of anti-Jewish discrimination. Similar restrictions were enacted throughout Europe as Christian authorities sought to limit Jewish influence on Christian society. The expulsion of Jews from England, 1290, France, 1306, 1322, and Spain, 1492, represented the culmination of medieval anti-Jewish policies. These expulsions were often motivated by economic opportunism as much as religious concerns, but they were justified through theological arguments about Christian purity. The conversion of Jews to Christianity, whether voluntary or forced, created new challenges for both communities. Converted Jews, conversos or new Christians, faced suspicion from both their former co-religionists and their new Christian neighbors, leading to ongoing tensions and the development of concepts of racial as opposed to religious identity. Jewish contributions to medieval culture. Despite persecution and restrictions, Jewish communities made significant contributions to medieval European culture that enriched both Jewish and Christian civilization. These contributions often occurred through indirect channels but were nonetheless substantial. Jewish scholars played crucial roles in the transmission of classical learning, particularly through their work in translating Greek and Arabic texts into Hebrew and Latin. The Jewish communities of southern France and Spain served as important intermediaries in the cultural exchange between Islamic and Christian worlds. Hebrew poetry and literature flourished in medieval Jewish communities, producing works that influenced broader European literary development. Poets like Solomon ibn Gabirol and Judah Halevi created works that combined religious themes with secular learning and literary sophistication. Jewish philosophical and theological works contributed to broader discussions about reason and revelation, divine attributes, and religious law. Christian scholars like Thomas Aquinas engaged seriously with Jewish philosophical arguments and incorporated some Jewish insights into Christian systematic theology. The development of Jewish law, halakha, during the medieval period created sophisticated legal systems that paralleled and sometimes influenced Christian canon law. The responsa literature, which provided rabbinical answers to legal questions, created networks of Jewish learning that transcended political boundaries. Jewish communities preserved and transmitted important historical and cultural information through their chronicles, commentaries, and community records. These sources provide crucial evidence for understanding medieval European social, economic, and religious development. Chapter 7. Popular Religion and Folk Traditions. The Christianization of Popular Culture. The process of Christianizing European popular culture was lengthy, complex, and never entirely complete. Rather than simply replacing pre-Christian traditions, Christianity often absorbed, transformed, or coexisted with existing religious practices, creating distinctive forms of popular Christianity. The cult of saints provided one of the most important mechanisms for the Christianization of local traditions. Many Christian saints assumed the functions of earlier pagan deities, and their shrines were often established at sites that had previous religious significance. This process allowed for continuity of religious practice while gradually shifting the focus from pagan to Christian figures. The Christian calendar incorporated many pre-Christian festivals while transforming their meaning and symbolism. Christmas absorbed winter solstice celebrations, Easter incorporated spring fertility rituals, and various saint days replaced local seasonal festivals. This accommodation made Christianity more accessible to recently converted populations. Local pilgrimage sites and shrines became focal points for popular religious expression that often blended Christian devotion with older magical and healing traditions. The cults of miraculous images, healing springs, and wonder-working relics provided tangible connections to the sacred that satisfied popular religious needs. The persistence of magical practices alongside Christian devotion created ongoing tensions between popular and official religion. Church authorities struggled to distinguish between legitimate religious practices and superstitious or demonic activities, leading to the development of increasingly sophisticated theories about the supernatural. Pilgrimage and popular devotion. Pilgrimage became one of the most characteristic expressions of medieval popular religion, combining spiritual aspiration with adventure, penance, and social interaction. The great pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela created international networks of religious and cultural exchange. The development of local pilgrimage sites made pilgrimage accessible to people who could not undertake major journeys. Shrines like Canterbury in England, Mont Saint-Michel in France, and numerous Marian sanctuaries throughout Europe attracted pilgrims from surrounding regions and created economic opportunities for local communities. Pilgrimage practices evolved throughout the medieval period, incorporating new devotional forms and responding to changing theological emphases. The development of indulgences for pilgrimage, the creation of guidebooks and itineraries, and the establishment of hospices and services for pilgrims all reflected the institutionalization of popular religious practices. The social aspects of pilgrimage were as important as the spiritual ones. Pilgrimage provided opportunities for social mobility, cultural exchange, and escape from routine obligations. The temporary communities formed by pilgrimage groups created new forms of religious fellowship that transcended normal social boundaries. Women's participation in pilgrimage created particular challenges for medieval society, as it involved travel and independence that contradicted normal expectations about female behavior. However, pilgrimage also provided women with opportunities for religious expression and social interaction that were otherwise limited. The development of religious drama in the later medieval period created new forms of popular religious expression that made theological concepts accessible to largely illiterate populations. Mystery plays, morality plays, and passion dramas became important vehicles for religious education and community celebration. The cycle plays performed in cities like York, Chester, and Coventry involved entire urban communities in the production and performance of biblical stories. These productions required cooperation between religious and secular authorities, guild organizations, and ordinary citizens, creating shared religious experiences that strengthened community bonds. The theological content of medieval religious drama was often sophisticated, addressing complex questions about salvation, divine justice, and human nature through dramatic presentation. The Second Shepherd's Play from the Wakefield cycle, for example, used comedy and contemporary references to explore themes of incarnation and redemption. The performance of religious drama in vernacular languages made theological concepts accessible to audiences who could not understand Latin liturgy or theological treatises. This democratization of religious knowledge had significant implications for the development of popular theology and religious understanding. The visual and emotional impact of religious drama created powerful religious experiences that complemented but differed from liturgical worship. The emphasis on spectacle, emotion, and audience participation in religious drama reflected changing sensibilities about the appropriate forms of religious expression. Superstition and Christian practice. The relationship between Christian doctrine and popular magical practices remained complex and contested throughout the medieval period. While church authorities consistently condemned superstition and magic, the boundaries between legitimate Christian practices and forbidden magical activities were often unclear. The use of Christian symbols, prayers, and rituals for protective or healing purposes was widespread among medieval Christians but raised questions about the proper understanding of divine power. Practices like wearing amulets with biblical verses, using holy water for healing, or seeking supernatural assistance through prayer walked fine lines between devotion and magic. The development of Christian approaches to popular healing traditions required careful theological distinctions between divine miracle, natural remedy, and demonic intervention. The Church's acceptance of some healing practices while rejecting others reflected attempts to channel popular religious impulses in orthodox directions. Seasonal celebrations and agricultural rituals provided particular challenges for Christian authorities, as these practices often had deep pre-Christian roots while serving important social and economic functions. The Christianization of harvest festivals, blessing of fields, and seasonal ceremonies required theological creativity and practical accommodation. The persistence of belief in supernatural beings like fairies, demons, and ghosts alongside Christian theology created complex popular cosmologies that blended Christian and pre-Christian elements. Church authorities developed increasingly sophisticated theories about the spiritual realm to address these popular beliefs. Women's religious experience. Women's religious experience in the medieval period was shaped by both the opportunities and restrictions that Christian culture provided. While formal religious authority was largely denied to women, they found numerous ways to express religious devotion and achieve spiritual influence. The development of women's monastic communities provided opportunities for religious life that were otherwise unavailable to medieval women. Abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen achieved significant religious authority and intellectual influence while maintaining formal subordination to male ecclesiastical authority. The emergence of new forms of religious life for women, including beguines, anchoresses, and tertiaries affiliated with mendicant orders, reflected women's desire for religious expression beyond traditional monastic options. These movements created alternative forms of religious community that gave women greater autonomy and flexibility. Women's mystical experiences often provided them with religious authority that transcended normal gender restrictions. Mystics like Julian of Norwich, Catherine of Siena, and Marjorie Kemp claimed direct divine inspiration that legitimated their religious teaching and influence. The cult of the Virgin Mary provided a powerful focus for women's religious devotion while offering a model of female holiness that was accessible to lay women. Marian devotion became increasingly elaborate during the later medieval period and provided important forms of religious expression for women. Women's participation in popular religious movements, pilgrimage, and lay religious organizations created networks of female religious activity that operated alongside but often independent of official church structures. These activities provided women with opportunities for religious leadership and social influence. The development of sacred architecture. Medieval religious architecture evolved from the practical needs of Christian worship to become sophisticated expressions of theological vision and artistic ambition. The development from early Christian basilicas through Romanesque and Gothic styles reflected changing religious sensibilities and technical capabilities. The Romanesque style that dominated European church architecture from roughly 950 to 1150 emphasized massive walls, small windows, and elaborate sculptural decoration. Romanesque churches created interior spaces that emphasized the mystery and transcendence of divine worship while providing practical accommodation for pilgrimage and liturgical needs. The sculptural programs of Romanesque churches provided comprehensive visual education for largely illiterate congregations. The tympana, capitals, and portals of churches like Saint Foy at Conques and Saint Lazare at Autun told biblical stories, illustrated theological concepts, and provided moral instruction through sophisticated iconographic programs. The emergence of Gothic architecture in the mid-12th century represented a revolutionary transformation in both engineering and aesthetic approach. The use of pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses allowed for unprecedented height and light while creating interior spaces that seemed to dissolve the boundaries between earthly and heavenly realms. The great Gothic cathedrals of the 13th century represented collective achievements that involved entire urban communities and required decades or centuries to complete. The construction of Notre Dame de Paris, Chartres Cathedral, and Amiens Cathedral demanded enormous financial resources and technical expertise while creating monuments to medieval Christian civilization. Manuscript illumination and religious art. The production of illuminated manuscripts provided one of the most important forms of medieval religious art, combining textual and visual elements to create comprehensive religious experiences. Manuscript illumination evolved from simple decorative elements to sophisticated artistic programs that rivaled any other form of medieval art. The great gospel books of the early medieval period, including the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels, created distinctive insular styles that combined Christian iconography with Celtic and Germanic decorative traditions. These manuscripts demonstrated the flexibility of Christian art in adapting to different cultural contexts. The development of scriptoriums in monasteries and cathedrals created centers of artistic production that preserved and transmitted both classical and Christian artistic traditions. The collaboration between scribes, illuminators, and bookbinders required sophisticated organizational skills and created shared artistic vocabularies. The books of hours that became popular in the later medieval period provided personalized religious experiences for lay people who could afford luxurious manuscripts. These books combined liturgical texts with elaborate decorative programs that reflected both personal devotion and social status. The transition from parchment to paper and the development of printing in the 15th century transformed manuscript production and made religious texts more widely available. However, the tradition of manuscript illumination continued to influence printed book decoration and artistic production. Stained glass and light theology. The development of stained glass windows in Gothic cathedrals created new possibilities for religious art that combined architectural, artistic, and theological elements. Stained glass windows transformed natural light into colored illumination that seemed to demonstrate the divine transformation of the material world. Abbot Suger's theological understanding of light as a pathway to divine truth provided the intellectual foundation for the development of Gothic stained glass programs. Suger's writings on the rebuilding of St. Denis articulated a theology that understood material beauty as a means of spiritual elevation. The great rose windows and narrative cycles of Gothic cathedrals created comprehensive visual programs that told biblical stories, illustrated theological concepts, and provided moral instruction. The windows of Chartres Cathedral, for example, combined Old and New Testament scenes with contemporary saints and donors to create unified theological statements. The production of stained glass windows required sophisticated technical skills and artistic vision that involved collaboration between designers, glaziers, and donors. The workshops that produced cathedral windows created artistic traditions that influenced European art for centuries. The symbolic use of light and color in Gothic stained glass reflected broader theological developments that emphasized divine illumination and spiritual transformation. The experience of worship in spaces filled with colored light created distinctive forms of religious experience that complemented liturgical and musical developments. Religious music and liturgical development. The development of medieval religious music paralleled architectural and artistic developments while creating distinctive forms of spiritual expression that enhanced liturgical worship and personal devotion. Medieval music evolved from simple chant to complex polyphonic compositions that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both musical theory and theological symbolism. Gregorian chant provided the foundation of medieval religious music through its systematic organization of musical settings for liturgical texts. The development of musical notation and theoretical understanding allowed for the preservation and transmission of musical traditions that unified Christian worship across Europe. The emergence of polyphonic music in the later medieval period created new possibilities for musical expression that reflected theological concepts about divine harmony and cosmic order. The development of motets, masses, and other polyphonic forms allowed composers to create musical structures that paralleled architectural and theological developments. The construction of organs in Gothic cathedrals provided new possibilities for musical expression that complemented architectural grandeur and liturgical solemnity. The development of keyboard instruments and polyphonic performance created rich musical experiences that enhanced the overall impact of Gothic religious architecture. The composition of vernacular religious songs and carols made religious music accessible to lay people who could not participate in complex liturgical music. These popular religious songs created shared musical traditions that strengthened community religious identity and provided outlets for personal devotion. The recovery of Aristotle. The translation of Aristotelian works from Arabic into Latin during the 12th and 13th centuries created unprecedented challenges and opportunities for medieval Christian theology. The availability of sophisticated philosophical tools required theologians to develop new approaches to fundamental questions about faith and reason. The initial reception of Aristotelian philosophy was marked by suspicion and condemnation from church authorities who recognized the potential conflicts between Aristotelian positions and Christian doctrine. The University of Paris banned the teaching of Aristotelian natural philosophy in 1210 and 1215, though these restrictions were gradually relaxed. The work of translators like Gerard of Cremona and Michael Scott made available not only Aristotelian texts but also the commentaries of Islamic philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes. These Islamic interpretations of Aristotle presented sophisticated philosophical systems that influenced Christian engagement with Aristotelian thought. The challenge of reconciling Aristotelian philosophy with Christian faith stimulated the development of new theological methods and the creation of comprehensive theological systems. The scholastic method that emerged from this challenge would dominate Christian theology for centuries. The recovery of Aristotle. The translation of Aristotelian works from Arabic into Latin during the 12th and 13th centuries created unprecedented challenges and opportunities for medieval Christian theology. The availability of sophisticated philosophical tools required theologians to develop new approaches to fundamental questions about faith and reason. The initial reception of Aristotelian philosophy was marked by suspicion and condemnation from church authorities who recognized the potential conflicts between Aristotelian positions and Christian doctrine. The University of Paris banned the teaching of Aristotelian natural philosophy in 1210 and 1215, though these restrictions were gradually relaxed. The work of translators like Gerard of Cremona and Michael Scott made available not only Aristotelian texts but also the commentaries of Islamic philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes. These Islamic interpretations of Aristotle presented sophisticated philosophical systems that influenced Christian engagement with Aristotelian thought. The challenge of reconciling Aristotelian philosophy with Christian faith stimulated the development of new theological methods and the creation of comprehensive theological systems. The scholastic method that emerged from this challenge would dominate Christian theology for centuries. The emergence of the mendicant orders created new contexts for theological education and development that transformed medieval scholasticism. The Dominican and Franciscan intellectual traditions approached theological questions from different perspectives while contributing to the overall sophistication of medieval theology. The Dominican emphasis on preaching and combating heresy led to the development of systematic theology that could address contemporary challenges while maintaining orthodox positions. Dominican theologians like Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas created comprehensive theological systems that incorporated the best available philosophical learning. The Franciscan intellectual tradition, influenced by the order's emphasis on poverty and spiritual experience, developed distinctive approaches to theological questions that emphasize divine will, spiritual illumination, and the limits of rational knowledge. Franciscan theologians like Bonaventure and Duns Scotus offered alternatives to Dominican rationalism. The competition between Dominican and Franciscan theological schools stimulated theological development through ongoing debates about fundamental questions. Disagreements about the relationship between essence and existence, the nature of divine knowledge, and the role of human reason in theological investigation created rich theological discussions. Thomas Aquinas and the synthesis of faith and reason. Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274, achieved the most influential synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology in his Summa Theologica and other works. The Thomistic system demonstrated the compatibility of rational philosophy and revealed religion while maintaining the distinctiveness of each realm. Thomas's approach to theological questions reflected his conviction that grace builds upon nature rather than destroying or replacing it. This principle allowed him to incorporate Aristotelian insights about the natural world while maintaining the necessity of divine revelation for supernatural truths. The structure of the Summa Theologica demonstrated Thomas's systematic approach to theological questions through its organization around God, human nature, and Christ as the way of return to God. This tripartite structure provided a comprehensive framework for addressing all aspects of Christian doctrine. Thomas's philosophical theology addressed fundamental questions about the existence and nature of God, the relationship between divine and human knowledge, and the compatibility of divine sovereignty with human freedom. His solutions to these problems influenced Catholic theology for centuries. The Thomistic understanding of law as rational ordering directed toward the common good provided important foundations for medieval political theory and moral theology. Thomas's treatment of natural law, human law, and divine law created frameworks for addressing questions about political authority and moral obligation. Mystical theology and scholastic learning. The relationship between mystical experience and scholastic theology remained complex throughout the medieval period. While some mystics rejected academic learning as impediment to spiritual experience, others sought to integrate intellectual and spiritual approaches to religious truth. The Victorine school, associated with the Abbey of Saint Victor in Paris, developed approaches to theology that combined rigorous scholarship with spiritual discipline. Hugh of Saint Victor and Richard of Saint Victor created theological systems that incorporated both rational investigation and mystical experience. The German mystics of the 14th century, particularly Meister Eckhart, developed sophisticated theological accounts of mystical experience that drew on scholastic learning while pushing beyond its limitations. Eckhart's sermons and treatises demonstrated the possibility of combining academic theology with popular spiritual instruction. The development of mystical theology as a distinct theological discipline reflected attempts to systematize spiritual experience and provide theological frameworks for understanding direct religious experience. Works like the Mystical Theology of Dionysius the Pseudo-Areopagite influenced both academic theologians and practicing mystics. The tensions between academic and mystical approaches to theology reflected broader questions about the relationship between reason and experience, learning and holiness, and institutional and personal authority in religious matters. These tensions would persist throughout the medieval period and beyond. The 14th and 15th centuries witnessed significant challenges to the scholastic synthesis that had dominated 13th century theology. These challenges came from multiple directions and contributed to the intellectual ferment that would eventually produce the Protestant Reformation. The nominalist philosophy associated with William of Ockham questioned fundamental assumptions about the relationship between universal concepts and particular realities that had supported earlier theological systems. Ockham's emphasis on divine freedom and power created new challenges for traditional theological arguments. The development of via moderna, the modern way, in late medieval universities provided alternative approaches to theological questions that emphasized empirical investigation, logical analysis, and systematic doubt. These approaches prepared the ground for later developments in both theology and natural philosophy. The conciliar crisis stimulated new thinking about ecclesiastical authority that influenced theological method as well as church governance. The question of whether church councils or popes possessed ultimate authority required theologians to examine fundamental assumptions about revelation, tradition, and religious authority. The growth of mystical and devotional movements that emphasized personal religious experience over institutional authority created new challenges for academic theology. The popularity of works like The Imitation of Christ suggested dissatisfaction with complex theological systems and desire for simpler forms of religious truth. Late medieval spirituality and reform movements. The 15th century witnessed a remarkable diversity of reform movements that sought to renew Christian life through various approaches to spiritual and institutional reform. These movements reflected both dissatisfaction with existing conditions and creative responses to changing social and intellectual circumstances. The Devotio Moderna movement, centered in the Low Countries, promoted practical spirituality that emphasized personal devotion, moral reformation, and the imitation of Christ. The Brethren of the Common Life established schools and communities that influenced thousands of people, including future reformers like Erasmus and Luther. The observant movement within established religious orders sought to restore strict adherence to original religious rules that had been relaxed over time. Observant reforms affected Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, and other orders throughout Europe, creating renewed emphasis on poverty, prayer, and spiritual discipline. Conciliar reform movements continued to advocate for institutional changes that would address corruption, improve clerical education, and restore effective church governance. The reform councils of the 15th century achieved limited success but kept alive ideals of reform that would influence later developments. Lay religious movements, including confraternities, third orders, and independent religious groups, created new opportunities for religious expression that bypassed traditional institutional structures. These movements often emphasized social service, mutual support, and practical Christianity that appealed to urban populations. Humanism and religious reform. The emergence of Renaissance humanism created new approaches to religious questions that emphasized textual scholarship, historical consciousness, and individual spiritual development. Humanist scholars applied new philological methods to biblical and patristic texts while developing new forms of Christian spirituality. Desiderius Erasmus, 1466 to 1536, exemplified the humanist approach to religious reform through his scholarly editions of biblical and patristic texts, his satirical criticisms of contemporary religious practices, and his promotion of simple, practical Christianity. Erasmus's praise of folly and other works influenced reform movements throughout Europe. The development of printing made possible the wide dissemination of humanist scholarship and reform ideas. The publication of Greek and Hebrew biblical texts, critical editions of church fathers, and vernacular religious literature created new opportunities for religious education and reform. Humanist educational reforms promoted the study of classical languages, rhetoric, and history that provided tools for biblical scholarship and theological investigation. The emphasis on eloquence and persuasion also influenced preaching and religious instruction throughout Europe. The humanist emphasis on individual spiritual development and direct engagement with biblical texts challenged traditional assumptions about religious authority and the necessity of clerical mediation. These ideas would prove influential for Protestant reformers who emphasized individual faith and biblical authority. The state of the Church on the eve of reform. By 1500, the Catholic Church faced multiple challenges that created widespread desire for reform while revealing the limitations of existing institutional structures. The accumulation of criticisms and problems created conditions that would make dramatic reform movements virtually inevitable. The Renaissance papacy's involvement in Italian politics and its patronage of humanist culture created tensions between spiritual and temporal concerns that scandalized many Christians. The financial demands of papal projects, including the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica, required fundraising methods that proved controversial. Clerical corruption and ignorance remained persistent problems despite reform efforts. The buying and selling of church offices, the violation of clerical celibacy, and the neglect of pastoral duties created widespread dissatisfaction with clerical leadership and institutional effectiveness. The complexity of late medieval religious practices, including the system of indulgences, purgatorial beliefs, and devotion to saints and relics, created opportunities for abuse and exploitation that reformers would vigorously criticize. The commercialization of spiritual practices seemed to many to contradict fundamental Christian values. The growth of lay literacy and religious education created new expectations about religious instruction and participation that existing institutional structures could not adequately meet. The development of vernacular religious literature and popular religious movements demonstrated widespread desire for more accessible forms of Christianity. Intellectual and cultural foundations of reform. The intellectual and cultural developments of the late medieval period created foundations for the religious reforms that would transform European Christianity in the 16th century. These developments included new approaches to biblical scholarship, changing concepts of religious authority, and evolving understandings of individual spirituality. The development of critical approaches to historical texts, including biblical manuscripts and church documents, created new awareness of the historical development of Christian doctrine and institutions. This historical consciousness would prove crucial for reformers who sought to return to earlier forms of Christianity. The persistence of conciliar ideas about church governance, despite the restoration of papal authority, kept alive alternative concepts of religious authority that would influence Protestant theories about church organization and the authority of Scripture over tradition. The development of national consciousness and vernacular literature created new possibilities for religious expression that bypassed Latin Christianity's international character. The translation of religious texts into vernacular languages made possible new forms of popular religious participation. Byzantine Christianity and imperial authority. The Byzantine Empire created a distinctive form of Christianity that combined Greek theological traditions with imperial political structures in ways that differed significantly from Western European developments. The relationship between emperor and church in Byzantium established patterns of Caesaropapism that influenced Eastern Christianity for centuries. The emperor's role as head of the Christian Commonwealth gave Byzantine rulers unprecedented authority over ecclesiastical affairs, including the appointment of patriarchs, the convening of church councils, and the determination of religious policies. This system created both opportunities for effective church governance and dangers of political manipulation of religious matters. The development of Byzantine liturgy created forms of Christian worship that emphasized transcendence, mystery, and imperial grandeur. The divine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom became the standard form of worship throughout the Byzantine world, creating unified religious practices that reinforced imperial authority. Byzantine theological traditions maintained closer connections to patristic sources than did Western Christianity, partly due to the continued use of Greek as a theological language. The preservation of Greek patristic texts and the continuation of Greek theological scholarship created distinctive approaches to fundamental Christian doctrines. The iconoclastic controversies of the 8th and 9th centuries revealed tensions within Byzantine Christianity between imperial authority and monastic spirituality, between theological concerns about idolatry and popular religious practices, and between Byzantine and Western approaches to religious art and devotion. Monasticism and spirituality in the East. Eastern Christian monasticism developed along different lines from Western monasticism, emphasizing individual spiritual achievement over community organization and maintaining closer connections to the eremitic traditions of the early church. The holy mountain of Athos became the most important center of Byzantine monastic life. The development of hesychasm, a form of mystical prayer that emphasized the invocation of the name of Jesus and the vision of divine light, created distinctive forms of Eastern Christian spirituality. The hesychast controversies of the 14th century revealed tensions between mystical and scholastic approaches to theology. Saint Gregory Palamas, 1296–1359, provided theological justification for hesychast practices through his distinction between God's essence and energies. This theological position allowed for mystical experience of divine energies while maintaining divine transcendence, but it also created new points of difference with Western theological traditions. The influence of monastic spirituality on Byzantine Christianity was greater than in the West, partly due to the empire's political difficulties and the consequent emphasis on otherworldly concerns. Many Byzantine emperors ended their lives as monks, and monastic ideals influenced imperial policies and cultural values. The relationship between Eastern and Western Christianity became increasingly strained throughout the medieval period, culminating in the mutual excommunications of 1054 that formally initiated the Great Schism between Orthodox and Catholic Christianity. Theological differences between East and West included disputes over the Filioque clause in the Nicene Creed, the nature of purgatory, clerical celibacy, and papal authority. These differences reflected underlying variations in theological method, cultural assumptions, and institutional development. The Crusades created new tensions between Eastern and Western Christianity, particularly after the Fourth Crusade's diversion to Constantinople in 1204. The establishment of Latin states in Byzantine territories and the imposition of Latin religious practices on Orthodox populations created lasting resentment. Attempts at church reunion, including the Council of Lyons, 1274, and the Council of Florence, 1439, failed to achieve lasting reconciliation due to theological differences and popular resistance in the Byzantine world. These failures demonstrated the depth of the divisions that had developed between Eastern and Western Christianity. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453 ended the Byzantine Empire but also created new opportunities for Orthodox Christianity to develop independently of imperial control. The emergence of Moscow as the Third Rome and the growth of Orthodox communities in the Ottoman Empire demonstrated the resilience of Eastern Christian traditions. The conversion of Slavic peoples to Christianity created new opportunities for Eastern Orthodox expansion while also generating distinctive forms of Christian culture that combined Slavic traditions with Byzantine religious practices. The missions of Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius to the Slavs in the 9th century established important precedents for vernacular Christianity through their creation of Slavonic literary languages and their translation of liturgical and biblical texts. These innovations allowed Slavic Christians to worship and study in their own languages rather than Greek or Latin. The conversion of Bulgaria, Serbia, and Russia to Orthodox Christianity extended Byzantine influence while also creating new centers of Orthodox learning and culture. The adaptation of Byzantine practices to Slavic cultural contexts created distinctive national forms of Orthodox Christianity. The development of Russian Christianity, particularly after the conversion of Vladimir I in 988, created the largest Orthodox Christian state and established Moscow's claims to succession from Byzantium. Russian Orthodox Christianity developed distinctive characteristics while maintaining connections to broader Orthodox traditions. The production of Slavonic religious literature, including lives of saints, theological treatises, and devotional works, created rich literary traditions that influenced Slavic culture for centuries. The adaptation of Byzantine artistic and architectural traditions to Slavic contexts created distinctive forms of Orthodox Christian culture. The medieval period witnessed the fundamental transformation of European society through the influence of Christianity, which became the dominant cultural force that shaped art, literature, law, politics, and social organization. This transformation created the foundations of European civilization that would persist well beyond the medieval period. The Christianization of European society involved not merely the adoption of new religious beliefs but the restructuring of entire cultural systems around Christian values and institutions. The development of Christian kingdoms, the establishment of ecclesiastical hierarchies, and the creation of Christian educational and charitable institutions all contributed to this comprehensive transformation. The medieval synthesis of Christian faith and classical learning created intellectual traditions that influenced European thought for centuries. The scholastic method, the development of universities, and the preservation of classical texts in Christian contexts all demonstrated the creative potential of this synthesis. The institutional innovations of medieval Christianity, including the papal monarchy, cathedral chapters, mendicant orders, and universities, created organizational models that influenced both religious and secular institutions throughout European history. The diversity of medieval Christianity. Medieval Christianity encompassed remarkable diversity in theological positions, spiritual practices, institutional forms, and cultural expressions. This diversity reflected the creative adaptation of Christian traditions to different social, cultural, and intellectual contexts throughout the medieval period. Regional variations in Christian practice, from Celtic Christianity in Ireland to Mozarabic Christianity in Spain, demonstrated the flexibility of Christian traditions while also creating ongoing tensions about orthodoxy and unity. The development of distinctive national forms of Christianity anticipated later Protestant emphases on vernacular religion. The emergence of new religious orders, reform movements, and spiritual traditions throughout the medieval period demonstrated the continuing vitality of Christian religious life. The ability of medieval Christianity to generate new forms of religious expression while maintaining institutional continuity was one of its most remarkable characteristics. The complex relationships between different Christian communities, including the tensions between Eastern and Western Christianity and the various relationships between Christians and other religious groups, revealed both the exclusivist tendencies and the adaptive capacities of medieval Christianity. The preparation for reform. The late medieval period created conditions that made major religious reform virtually inevitable. The accumulation of institutional problems, intellectual challenges, and spiritual concerns generated widespread desire for change while also providing tools for achieving reform. The humanist emphasis on textual scholarship and historical investigation provided methods for examining Christian origins and development that would prove crucial for Protestant reformers. The development of printing made possible the wide dissemination of reform ideas and biblical texts in vernacular languages. The growth of lay religious movements and the increasing literacy of European populations created new expectations about religious participation that existing institutional structures could not adequately meet. The development of vernacular religious literature demonstrated widespread desire for more accessible forms of Christianity. The intellectual developments of late medieval theology, including nominalism and mystical theology, created new approaches to fundamental religious questions that challenged existing theological syntheses while providing alternatives to traditional authorities. The enduring influence of medieval religion. The religious developments of the medieval period established patterns and institutions that continued to influence European Christianity well beyond 1500. The basic structures of Catholic Christianity, the fundamental divisions between Eastern and Western Christianity, and the intellectual frameworks developed by medieval theologians all provided foundations for subsequent religious development. The medieval understanding of the relationship between church and state, despite significant variations across time and place, established precedents and problems that would influence European political development for centuries. The competing claims of spiritual and temporal authority that characterized medieval politics continued to shape church-state relations into the modern period. The artistic and architectural achievements of medieval Christianity created aesthetic traditions that influenced European culture long after the medieval period ended. Gothic architecture, illuminated manuscripts, and religious music all established forms and conventions that continued to shape European artistic expression. The educational innovations of medieval Christianity, particularly the development of universities and the scholastic method, created intellectual institutions and approaches that became fundamental to Western higher education. The medieval integration of religious and secular learning established patterns that would persist despite later secularization. The medieval concept of Christendom, a unified Christian society encompassing all aspects of human life, represented one of the most ambitious attempts in human history to create a comprehensive religious culture. While this ideal was never fully realized, It profoundly influenced European development and provided a model that would be both emulated and rejected in later periods. The medieval vision of Christian society assumed the fundamental unity of religious and secular concerns, viewing all human activities as potentially sacred and all social institutions as properly ordered toward divine purposes. This holistic approach created both remarkable cultural achievements and significant tensions that would eventually contribute to its dissolution. The international character of medieval Christianity, transcending political boundaries through shared liturgy, law, and intellectual traditions, created the first truly European culture. The networks of communication and exchange established by medieval Christianity provided foundations for subsequent European political and cultural development. The medieval emphasis on hierarchy and authority as natural features of divine order influenced European social and political structures for centuries. The gradual erosion of these assumptions would prove crucial for later developments in democratic theory and individual rights. Religious pluralism and tolerance. The medieval experience of religious diversity, while often characterized by conflict and persecution, also provided important lessons about the possibilities and limitations of religious coexistence. The complex relationships between Christianity, Islam, and Judaism in medieval Europe revealed both the potential for mutual learning and the dangers of religious extremism. The development of Christian theological responses to other religions during the medieval period established frameworks for interfaith dialogue that would prove influential for later ecumenical and interfaith movements. The scholastic engagement with Islamic and Jewish philosophy demonstrated the possibilities for religious intellectual exchange. The persistence of popular religious practices and folk traditions alongside official Christianity revealed the limits of institutional religious control and the importance of popular religious needs and expressions. This experience would prove relevant for later discussions about religious freedom and individual conscience. The medieval development of concepts of heresy and orthodoxy, while often leading to persecution and violence, also stimulated important theological reflection about the nature of religious truth and the proper response to religious disagreement. These discussions would influence later debates about religious tolerance and freedom of conscience. The transformation of religious authority. The medieval period witnessed fundamental changes in concepts and structures of religious authority that would have lasting influence on Christian development. The evolution from charismatic leadership to institutional authority, the development of legal and theological frameworks for religious governance, and the ongoing tensions between different sources of religious authority all shaped subsequent Christian history. The medieval development of papal authority created both a model for centralized religious governance and a source of ongoing controversy about the proper structure of Christian institutions. The tensions between papal, conciliar, and individual religious authority that characterized late medieval Christianity would continue to influence Christian development. The emergence of new forms of religious authority through mystical experience, scholarly expertise, and popular religious movements challenged traditional institutional authorities while creating alternative models for religious leadership. These developments anticipated later Protestant emphases on individual religious authority and the priesthood of all believers. The medieval experience of religious reform movements demonstrated both the necessity of ongoing institutional renewal and the difficulties of achieving effective reform within established structures. The patterns of reform, resistance, and compromise that characterized medieval Christianity would be repeated in later periods. The legacy of medieval theology. The theological achievements of the medieval period established intellectual frameworks that continued to influence Christian thought long after the medieval synthesis dissolved. The scholastic integration of faith and reason, the development of systematic theology, and the creation of comprehensive theological systems all provided resources for subsequent theological development. The medieval emphasis on the compatibility of faith and reason, despite later challenges, established important precedents for Christian intellectual engagement with secular learning. The methods and assumptions developed by medieval theologians continued to influence Christian approaches to philosophy, science, and other forms of knowledge. The diversity of medieval theological traditions, from Augustinian to Thomistic to nominalist approaches, provided alternative frameworks for addressing fundamental theological questions that would prove influential for later theological development. The ongoing debates between different theological schools demonstrated the vitality of medieval intellectual life. The medieval development of mystical theology and spiritual traditions created resources for understanding religious experience that would prove valuable for later spiritual renewals and reform movements. The integration of intellectual and experiential approaches to religious truth established patterns that would influence subsequent Christian spirituality. The preparation for modernity. The medieval period, while often characterized as pre-modern or anti-modern, actually created many of the intellectual, institutional, and cultural foundations that made modernity possible. The medieval development of universities, legal systems, and political institutions all contributed to later European development. The medieval emphasis on rational investigation of natural and divine reality, despite its theological framework, established precedents for scientific inquiry that would prove important for the scientific revolution. The scholastic confidence in human reason's ability to understand divine creation provided foundations for later scientific optimism. The medieval development of individual religious consciousness, particularly through mystical traditions and reform movements, anticipated later emphases on individual rights and personal autonomy. The medieval recognition of the importance of individual religious experience would influence later developments in political and social theory. The medieval creation of international institutions and networks demonstrated the possibilities for transnational organization and cooperation that would prove relevant for later European and global development. The medieval vision of universal human community under divine authority would influence later concepts of international law and human rights. Epilogue. The end of medieval Christianity. As the 15th century drew to a close, medieval Christianity faced unprecedented challenges that would transform it beyond recognition. The Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and the gradual secularization of European society would all draw on medieval precedents while fundamentally altering the religious landscape that had dominated European life for 1,000 years. The medieval achievement in creating a comprehensive Christian culture was remarkable in scope and ambition. The integration of religious faith with intellectual inquiry, artistic expression, social organization, and political authority created a civilization of extraordinary richness and complexity. The cathedrals that soared toward heaven, the universities that preserved and transmitted learning, the monasteries that provided spiritual refuge and social service, and the theological systems that sought to understand divine truth all testified to the creative power of medieval religious culture. Yet this achievement came at considerable cost. The medieval emphasis on religious conformity and institutional authority often led to persecution of dissent and suppression of alternative viewpoints. The entanglement of religious and political power created opportunities for corruption and abuse that scandalized believers and discredited religious institutions. The complexity of medieval religious practices sometimes obscured rather than clarified fundamental spiritual truths. The legacy of medieval Christianity is thus ambiguous and contested. Its institutional innovations, intellectual achievements, and cultural contributions created foundations for subsequent European development that proved both enabling and constraining. Its vision of comprehensive Christian society provided a model that would inspire later religious movements while also creating expectations that proved impossible to sustain. The study of medieval religion reveals both the possibilities and limitations of religious culture as an organizing principle for human society. The medieval attempt to create a unified Christian civilization represents one of history's most ambitious religious projects, and its ultimate transformation rather than collapse demonstrates both the resilience and the adaptability of religious traditions in the face of changing historical circumstances. As we reflect on this thousand-year story of medieval religious development, we see patterns of creativity and stagnation, innovation and tradition, success and failure that remind us of the complex relationship between religious ideals and historical realities. The medieval religious legacy continues to influence contemporary debates about the role of religion in public life, the relationship between faith and reason, and the possibilities for creating meaningful community in an increasingly diverse world. The medieval period thus represents not merely a historical epoch that has passed but a continuing presence in contemporary religious and cultural life. The questions that medieval Christians struggled with, the relationship between divine and human authority, the proper balance between individual and community needs, the role of tradition in religious understanding, and the possibility of achieving religious truth through human effort, remain central concerns for religious communities today. In studying medieval religion, we encounter not merely the historical development of particular religious institutions and ideas but the ongoing human struggle to understand divine reality and organize human life in accordance with ultimate values. The medieval Christian attempt to create a comprehensive religious culture provides both inspiration and warning for contemporary efforts to address the religious dimensions of human existence. The transformation of medieval Christianity into the diverse religious landscape of early modern and modern Europe reminds us that religious traditions, however seemingly permanent, are constantly adapting to new circumstances and challenges. The ability of Christianity to survive and flourish through such fundamental transformation testifies to both the resilience of religious traditions and the continuing human need for spiritual meaning and community. As we conclude this survey of medieval religious history, we are left with appreciation for both the achievements and the limitations of medieval Christianity. The 1,000 years from 500 to 1500 CE witnessed the creation of religious institutions, intellectual traditions, and cultural forms that would influence human development far beyond the medieval period itself. The story of medieval religion is thus not merely one chapter in human religious history but a continuing influence on contemporary religious and cultural life. The medieval religious experience reminds us that the relationship between religious faith and historical development is complex and dynamic. Religious traditions both shape and are shaped by the societies in which they develop. The medieval Christian synthesis of faith and culture created extraordinary achievements while also generating problems and contradictions that would eventually require fundamental transformation. Understanding medieval religion thus provides essential background for comprehending not only the development of Christianity and European civilization but also the broader patterns of religious and cultural development that continue to influence human society. The medieval period remains not merely historical background but a continuing presence in contemporary religious consciousness and cultural life. This survey of medieval religious history has attempted to trace the major developments, institutions, and transformations that characterized the 1,000-year period from roughly 500 to 1500 CE. The complexity and diversity of medieval religious life make any comprehensive treatment necessarily selective, but the themes and patterns examined here provide a foundation for understanding both the specific developments of medieval Christianity and the broader patterns of religious and cultural change that they represent. The medieval religious legacy continues to influence contemporary religious life through institutions, ideas, and cultural forms that originated during this crucial period in human religious development. The study of medieval religion thus provides not merely historical knowledge but continuing resources for understanding the role of religious faith in human life and the ongoing challenges of creating meaningful religious community in a complex world.